Part 14. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 131. No one can write 10 poems with different styles, and all of them are excellent works at the same time. One moment she led soldiers to fight at the border, the next moment she lamented her husband's death alone, the next moment she wrote about the unparalleled spirit of men, and the next moment she wrote about the tenderness of women. Even if he wanted to buy poems, he should have paid more attention. How many talented men and women did he find, and how much money did he spend to get these 10 poems together? Each of these poems has its own style, and it is difficult to tell which one is better than the other, but compared with other works tonight, the difference is obvious. Whether it is the works bought by Tang Zhao or the works of others, they cannot be compared with any of these. But if that were the case, there would be no need to ask Miss Su Mei to come out to choose tonight, because the 10 poems she chose were all picked by Xiao Gonggai, and no matter which one she chose, she would eventually choose Xiao Gonggai. "Why, haven't you chosen yet?" a voice that made people feel weak came from behind. The white-haired old man turned his head and looked at a figure walking over. He handed over a stack of papers in his hand and said, "Miss Su, you should take a look yourself." "Miss Su, have you chosen?" "Yes, let's see which masterpiece Miss Su has chosen." The crowd below was already a little impatient and urged them to speak. The woman looked at the stack of papers in her hand, picked out some, and asked, "Who wrote this? Why is there no signature?" The white-haired old man looked at her and said, "It's Xiao Gonggai." "What about this one?" "It's also Xiao Gonggai." "This poem?" "It's still Xiao Gonggai." The white-haired old man looked at her and said helplessly, "All the poems in Miss Su's hand are from Xiao Gonggai." The charming woman looked at him, her rosy lips moved, and her eyes finally looked at an elegant pavilion upstairs. After a moment, she lowered her head, picked a piece of paper from those papers, and said, "Then let's follow the rules of the poetry meeting. The rules of the poetry meeting are to choose the winner of the poem as the champion, and only look at the poems, not other things, whether they are bought or written by the author." Someone had already copied these poems and posted them on a wall. The difference is that Xiao Ju's name was written on the poems after copying. Although the poems were selected by Tianrunju, they also had to convince the public. Seeing this, everyone in the hall surrounded him. "Xiao Ju, Xiao Xiaogongyi also bought poems. I don't know who bought this poem from, but the quality is obviously much higher than that of others. Why is it Xiao Ju again? Xiao Gonggai bought 2 poems. Let's take a look at the next one. Why is it him again?" Soon, everyone stood under the wall where the poems were posted, looking at each other, stunned. 10 selected poems, all 10 of them are from young Master Xiao. They did not suspect that there was any shady deal, because these poems were posted on the wall, and who among the people present did not have the ability to distinguish the quality of poems, and each of these 10 poems was a classic. But, this is too shameless. The second young master of the Tang family bought poems, and he still had some dignity. The style of the poems was unified, and there was not much difference overall. But young Master Xiao, who died in battle, and was lonely and desolate in his boudoir, had he ever seen a real battlefield as a dandy in the capital, and when did his husband die? This is simply treating everyone as fools. I thought that young Master Xiao's shamelessness was just to go to a brothel and call 10 girls at once. I didn't expect it. I didn't expect that he would buy 10 poems. Does he have an obsession with 10? Can he bear to call 10 girls at a brothel? What can be endured? You don't know. It is said that when young Master Xiao went to a brothel, he just asked those prostitutes to take off their clothes except for their belly bands and underwear, and sit on the bed to feed mosquitoes. There is such a thing. He was not tempted by the beauty in front of him. Could it be? Brother Su, be careful, be careful. The 10 poems selected were all written by one person. This is a unique thing since Tianrunju held the Lantern Festival Poetry Festival. While appreciating those poems, everyone sighed at young Master Xiao's shamelessness and mourned for the second young master of the Tang family. He also bought 10 poems. It seems that he is determined to win the first place today. It is said that he bribed several selected people. As a result, none of them was selected. The money spent on this is just a small matter. It is difficult to regain the lost face. This is the biggest loser of the Lantern Festival Poetry Festival tonight. They are both dandy and shameless, but the second young master of the Tang family is far inferior to the young master Xiao in vision. In an elegant pavilion, Tang Zhao smashed the teacup and stood up from his seat suddenly, his face as gloomy as water. Lu Li stood beside him, lowered his head and trembled. Tang Zhao looked at him and gritted his teeth and said, "Didn't you say it was foolproof? Didn't you bribe the judges?" Lu Li shuddered and said in a trembling voice, He said that the 10 poems of the young master Xiao are all excellent works." The young man named Chang Yu stepped forward and said suspiciously, "Second young master, have you offended the young master Xiao? He never participated in these things in previous years, and I haven't heard that he recruited talents this year to win the first prize in the Lantern Festival Poetry Festival." Just because he wanted their elegant pavilion just now, Tang Zhao thought about it, and asked in disbelief, "Is Xiao Ju sick?" This possibility cannot be ruled out. Chang Yu thought about it and said, "Normally people would not go to a brothel and ask 10 girls to feed mosquitoes. Maybe he really wanted to retaliate against us because of what happened in the elegant pavilion just now." "Impossible," Tang Zhao shook his head and said, "if he just wanted to retaliate temporarily, where did his poems come from?" Chang Yu shook his head and said, "I don't know about that." Xiao Ju pushed the door open and walked out, comforting, "If you are not selected, you are not selected. The capital lacks everything except people who can write poems. Just have fun, don't take it seriously." Tang Ning nodded. If so much effort from the ancestors was spent, but there was still no result, then this poetry meeting was just a shady deal. Xiao Ju seemed to have thought of something, turned his head and looked at him, and said, "Next time I come to Tianrunja for dinner, lend me your sign." Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "Young Master Xiao, you are reluctant to spend even this little money. No one's money comes from the wind, so save it if you can." He put his arm around Tang Ning's shoulders and said, "We are friends, don't be so stingy. If anyone in the capital bullies you in the future, just say my name." They walked down the stairs and suddenly found something wrong. The atmosphere was strangely quiet. Tang Ning noticed something was wrong. When he raised his head, he saw that everyone in the hall was looking at them. To be precise, they were looking at Xiao Ju. There was envy, jealousy, contempt, and disdain in their eyes, which instantly made Xiao Ju the focus of the whole audience. Tang Ning was stunned for a moment, and the next moment he took 2 steps back and kept a distance from him. It turned out that he was so unpopular in the capital. If you encounter anything in the capital in the future, you must never say his name. He looked forward and saw the charming lady he had just met outside walking over. The charming lady looked at Xiao Ju and said with a smile, "Congratulations, young Master Xiao." Xiao Ju was stunned and asked in surprise, "What are you congratulating me for?" "Of course, congratulations to young Master Xiao for winning the first prize in tonight's poetry competition." The charming lady looked at him and said with a smile again, "Why not? Listen to people's laughter under the curtain, I like this sentence very much." "What champion?" "I didn't write any poems," Xiao Ju said in surprise, and then seemed to remember something, turned around and looked at Tang Ning, and said in shock, "It can't be you." Tang Ning looked at the window of a pavilion upstairs, where a figure looked at him. In the pavilion, Tang Zhao had a gloomy face and clenched his fists. Tang Ning calmly withdrew his gaze, looked at the charming woman, and asked, "Do I have to take the prize for the first prize myself, or will you give it to me?" "Prize?" Su Mei was slightly startled, and after coming to her senses, she looked at him and said, "I am the winner." Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 132. Tang Ning looked at the charming woman, not knowing whether he had not expressed himself clearly or she had not heard him clearly. Or maybe they regretted not giving the silver. It was only 1,000 taels in total, not that much, right? So he looked at her and said again, "Isn't there a prize for the champion of the poetry competition? Do I take the prize myself or do you give it to me?" Su Mei looked at him and said, "The prize is me." Tang Ning's face changed slightly. Whether in ancient or modern times, human trafficking is illegal, especially in ancient times, the punishment for human traffickers was extremely severe. According to Article 39 of Chapter 5 of Chen Law, anyone who kidnaps and sells people, robs graves, sets fires, or commits adultery shall be sentenced to death. Human traffickers and murderers, arsonists and rapers are sentenced together, which shows how serious the crime of human trafficking is. The second supplement to Article 39 also clearly states that anyone who sells people other than their own slaves or servants shall be crucified, which means being executed and then dismembered. Whether it is the seller or the buyer, they cannot escape the severe punishment of the law. Tang Ning looked at her and asked uncertainly, "Isn't it 1,000 taels of silver?" Xiaoju looked at him as if he was looking at a fool. If 1,000 taels of silver could buy an hour of being alone with Miss Su, there would be countless people in the capital who would fight for this opportunity. Now such an opportunity is in front of him, and he is still thinking about the 1,000 taels of silver? Su Mei was also stunned for a while before she reacted. She looked at him meaningfully and explained, "In addition to the 1,000 taels of silver, the leader can also be alone with me for an hour. Then you can send the silver to Hungzhou Pavilion, and forget about the second one." He thought Xiaoju had cheated him or Tianrunju wanted to regret it. Now it seems that it is not the case. It is enough to have 1,000 taels of silver. What's the point of being alone with her for an hour? It is useless. No, it's not useless, it's that he doesn't want to use it. The difference between useless and not wanting to use is the difference between him and Xiaoju. The way Xiaoju looked at him was no longer like looking at a fool, but looking at a fool. The maid behind Su Mei heard this and her face changed. All the capital knew that the champion of the Lantern Festival Poetry Festival had the opportunity to be alone with Miss Su Mei for an hour. If the champion only asked for silver and gave up the second one that everyone wanted, how would others look at her? Su Mei looked at Tang Ning for a long time before she said, "Sorry, either you want both or neither. This is the rule of Tianrunju." Since it was the rule of Tianrunju, he couldn't break it. Tang Ning thought about it and said, "Can the second one be converted into silver?" Su Mei looked at him and suddenly smiled. She asked, "Then how much silver do you think it should be converted into?" "I think it should be converted into." Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "Let's follow the rules of Tianrunju." The woman in front of her looked at her with a strange and familiar look. At this moment, Tang Ning thought of Tang Yao Yao. When she looked at him with such eyes, it meant that he was going to be in trouble. In addition to thinking of Tang Yao Yao's eyes, he also thought of her advice. Don't mess around outside. Is it considered messing around if you are alone in a room with another woman for an hour? Probably not. But to be on the safe side, Tang Ning still shook his head and looked at her and said, "Then I don't want it." Losing money is a small matter, but losing your chastity is a big matter. Peng Chen was watching next to him, and the old beggar was also watching next to him. If Xiaoi, Xiru or Tang Yao Yao asked him what he did in that hour that night, he would have no way to defend himself. Su Mei looked at him, still smiling, and asked, "Are you sure you don't want it, sir?" Although she was smiling, this smile had a sense of rejection. People began to gather around him, and Xiaoju pulled his sleeve and winked at him. Xiaoju usually gave people the impression of being carefree, but at this moment, his expression was somewhat serious. Tang Ning looked at the crowd that gathered around him, and seemed to understand something. He looked at Sumei and nodded, saying, "Then I will bother you for an hour." Sumei's smile spread, and she said, "It's not really a bother. Sir, please wait here for a moment. I will go downstairs to prepare." Tang Ning and Li Tianlan were invited back to a room. As soon as Xiaoju stepped into the room, he looked at him and said, "Are you crazy? Since you don't want to win, why write so much? Why write more poems? Just write some. Or don't write. If you write, you have to abide by the rules of Tianranju. If you win but don't want the reward, where will Tianranju's face be?" Xiaoju shook his head and said, "You just came to the capital and don't understand the twists and turns. Tianranju is not as simple as it appears on the surface." Even Xiaoju said so. It seems that Tianranju should have a big background. Tang Ning just realized that if he just walked away, it seemed a bit of a mess. He had no grudges against Tianranju. They even gave him a diamond-level membership card that could be used for free. If he messed up someone else's place, it would be a bit unreasonable and too unrefined. He looked at Xiaoju and asked, "Who is this Miss Su?" Xiaoju shook his head and said, "You don't know that Tianranju's network of relationships in the capital is extremely complicated. Many powerful officials have close ties with it. Miss Su is not only the apparent ruler of Tianranju, but also a famous beauty in the capital." "It's quite beautiful." Tang Ning nodded, and when she saw Li Tianlan's gaze looking over her unintentionally, she added, "But saying that the capital is famous is a bit exaggerated. It's not even close to Miss Li. We're going to the Lantern Festival tonight. That's when I saw at least 2 people with similar looks to her. You know nothing." Before he finished his sentence, the old beggar couldn't help but interjected, "That little girl is not only beautiful, she is also naturally charming. How can she be compared to any other woman? If you have the opportunity to practice with her in the future, those few secret books I gave you will help you know her." Tang Ning has realized a truth long ago. When there is a woman by your side, never say good things about another woman. No matter whether these 2 women have a relationship with you or not, it doesn't matter whether they have a relationship or not. Remember this. That's right. People like the old beggar who care about orphans don't understand this, so Li Tianlan's eyes turned from Tang Ning to him. A servant walked in from outside the door and said, "Sir, come with me. Miss Su is waiting for you upstairs." Peng Chen stood up, looked at the old beggar and asked, "So Su Mei is not simple, will she be in danger?" "Danger?" The old beggar glanced at him and said, "If this is dangerous, I would rather be in danger every day." Xiaoju looked at Tang Ning who was walking out, and then at Li Tianlan who was indifferent. A hint of doubt appeared on his face at first, and then he became filled with admiration. Tang Ning followed the servant to a room upstairs. The woman named Su Mei had already changed into a dress that was cooler than the one she wore just now, revealing a small section of her smooth collarbone. Tang Ning didn't know what the old beggar said about her naturally charming appearance, but this Su Mei the girl's collarbone is really beautiful. When people take one look at it, their eyes seem to be sinking in. Su Mei, this woman, just like her name, exudes charm all over her body. Su Mei blessed him slightly and said softly, "Master, please sit down." Her voice was so soft, it felt as if her whole body would soften when she heard it. Tang Ning somewhat understood what the old beggar meant by being naturally charming. She sat down at the table, stopped looking at her, and looked away. Neither of them spoke, and the atmosphere in the room fell into awkwardness. Su Mei pondered for a moment, then looked at him and said, "Why don't I play a flute for the young master first?" "What?" Tang Ning's expression changed drastically. She stood up suddenly, took a few steps back, looked at her, and said loudly, "Girl, please respect yourself. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 133. Tang Ning looked at Su Mei with alert eyes. We agreed that we would just spend an hour together. What did she mean? Su Mei turned around and took out a flute from the cabinet, turned around, looked at him with some confusion, and asked, "What's wrong?" Tang Ning looked at her, then at the xiao in her hand, and asked, "I mean, is the xiao in Miss Su's hand heavy?" "It's all Xiao Ju's fault. He pretended to be an expert in flowers. After chatting with him for more than half an hour this afternoon about his experiences in brothels, about the 48 moves and 36 postures, Tang Ning shook her head to clear these distracting thoughts from her mind. Su Mei looked at him, as if she had thought of something. A trace of embarrassment appeared on her face, and she gritted her teeth and said, "This is just an ordinary bamboo xiao, compared to the jade xiao, it is indeed much lighter." Tang Ning nodded and said, "Miss Su, let's get started." Su Mei looked at him for a long time, then smiled again on her face. "You're showing off your shame." "It's not like showing off one's embarrassment." Tang Ning really didn't understand the musical instrument. Su Mei played the flute in front of him, which was completely disrespectful. Thinking of this, there was already a whistle in my ears, which sounded a bit sad. Although Tang Ning didn't understand Xiao, she also knew that Xiao's voice was usually soothing and peaceful. Su Mei's Xiao was unhurried and slow, rising from low to high, as if it sounded directly in his mind, tugging at every heartstring in his heart. Su Mei's Xiao Sheng is like her own person, exuding a kind of charm from the inside out, charming but not glamorous. With just one glance, it's hard to look away. When you hear the prelude, you want to listen to the whole song. As Tang Ning listened to the music, she suddenly felt a little tired, her consciousness became extra clear, and she began to lose focus. Many sounds and images appeared in her mind. The day before he left, he and Zhongyi were chatting in the yard. Zhongyi rested her head on his shoulder and told him that even if he couldn't get the top prize, she could still fulfill her promise to him. There was also Xiao Ryu, who was packing his luggage for him while thinking at random that he should take good care of himself when he arrived in the capital, eat on time, remember to cover himself with a quilt when sleeping at night, don't forget to check before the exam, and don't forget to bring the exam guide. There was also Tang Fairy, who flew over from the other side of the wall and generously handed him a wad of banknotes, telling him that the capital was no better than Lingzhou and had more places to spend money. The money was lent to him and would be used from the profits from selling wine in the future. Buckle. Fang Xiaopang also handed a large bag of snacks into his hand. Thinking of this, he felt unusually peaceful in his heart, and a smile couldn't help but appear on his face. Until Qing'er's face appeared in front of his eyes, shouting, "Uncle, I can't get up in the morning," loudly. He was instantly awakened, but other pictures emerged in his mind. The early death of his parents in his previous life, the various faces of his relatives, the loneliness in the orphanage, and being bullied by older children. It was the darkest, most painful thing he had ever experienced in his 2 lives, and he was least willing to recall it. A period of time. But no matter what, these will never happen again. Because he can never go back, he will never see those snobbish relatives, nor will he be looked down upon by others because of his status as an orphan. Even visiting his parents' graves has become a luxury, in this country who are so far apart. In this world, a lonely soul that does not belong here, I don't know how long it will be floating. An inexplicable sadness surged out of my heart uncontrollably. In the room, the whispers had stopped. Su Mei looked at Tang Ning, who had tears streaming down her face, with a slightly strange look on her face. She didn't know what she was thinking. She has seen many people reveal their deepest desires under her whisper. Wealth, fame, power. And women. Or hatred. This is the deepest thing hidden in people's hearts. No matter how well hidden it is on weekdays, it will be exposed under the charm of her Xiao Sheng. She had never seen anyone like this. Lonely. Unimaginable loneliness like she had never seen before. It's different from being sober when everyone else is drunk. This is a kind of loneliness that seems to be incompatible with the whole world. His face is full of tears, and the skirt of his clothes is scratched because he holds it too tightly. Sume looked at him with some curiosity in her heart. What has he experienced, and what kind of experience can make a person have endless loneliness hidden in his heart? She walked over to him, wanting to see more clearly. Tang Ning felt like her soul was floating in a boundless space. Everything she looked around was filled with darkness, making it hard to tell the direction and how long it would last. He just drifted unconsciously until a pair of clear eyes appeared in his mind. That dirty little face has been engraved deep in his soul, and those pair of smart and clear eyes will never be forgotten by Tang Ning. He opened his eyes and saw Sume's face and a faint fragrance. Her face was so close that he only had to move a little closer to kiss her red lips. Tang Ning resisted the temptation deep in her heart, looked at her calmly, and reminded, "Miss Su." Sume looked at him, then walked back without changing her expression, sat on the other side of the table, handed over a handkerchief, and asked, "What's wrong with Mr. Tang?" "Thank you." Tang Ning took the handkerchief, wiped her eyes, and said, "I just thought about some past events, and I was a little rude. Please forgive me, Miss Su." Sume smiled and said, "It's okay." Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "How long has it been now?" "About a quarter of an hour." "Only a quarter of an hour," Tang Ning was a little disappointed. "An hour is 2 hours, and a quarter of an hour is 15 minutes. Only 1/8 of the time has passed. He still has more than half of the time to endure." Sume looked at him and said softly, "Mr. Tang." "Stop." When this woman spoke, her voice was so soft that it made people's bones soft. Tang Ning couldn't stand it. He looked at her and said, "Miss Su, can you speak properly?" Sume was stunned. After realizing it, she said shyly, "What do you mean? Isn't it possible to speak properly?" Tang Ning looked at her and said, "I mean, just talk to me in the same tone as before, don't pretend to be so soft, I'm not used to that." "Pretend?" Sume looked at him, her chest heaving slightly, and for the first time, she couldn't control her emotions. She has been in the capital for so long. Which man would not be careful when seeing her? Who would tell her that her voice was too pretentious and asked her not to speak like that? This made her doubt her charm for the first time, and this was exactly what she had never doubted before. She smiled again and said softly, "Why are you so unromantic?" Tang Ning stood up and said, "Miss Su, if you continue like this, I will leave." Sume's smile disappeared instantly and she looked at him and said, "Give me back the sign. I don't want to give it to you anymore." Tang Ning finally understood what it meant to change one's face faster than turning the pages of a book. This Miss Su was born to be an actress. She was tearing herself apart from him and didn't want to pretend to be a lady anymore. She even did such a childish thing. Tang Ning looked at her and said, "A real man should keep his word. How can you take back something that has been given away?" Sume stopped pretending to be cute and said disdainfully, "I am not a real man, I am a little woman." Tang Ning looked her up and down and asked, "How are you young?" Sume narrowed her eyes and looked at him, "What do you mean?" Tang Ning looked at her and said, "I mean, Miss Su should be in her early 20s, 24 or 25. Sume couldn't bear it anymore, she slapped the table and stood up, looking at him, breathing rapidly. She said, "It's only been a few days since my 20th birthday. She just turned 20, and she calls herself old lady and dresses so maturely. In the future, 20-year-old girls have not graduated from college yet. However, after all, he is still a 17-year-old boy. This Miss Su is 3 years older than him, so she is not young." Tang Ning shook his head and said, 20 years old is not young. Seeing Su Mei holding the flute tightly in her hand, Tang Ning was worried that she would use it to beat herself, so he hurriedly said, "It's still early, why don't we do something else?" Warm Ti. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 134. An unknown talent produced 10 excellent poems, blinding everyone's eyes and taking the lead. The poetry meeting has ended, but the performance is still going on, and the excitement will last until dawn the next day. In the pavilion on the first floor of AncientChina, everyone was still gathering under the wall where the poems were posted. Someone looked back at a certain room upstairs with doubts on their faces and said, "It's not Mr. Xiao. Who is the person next to him? Why have I never seen him before?" A person next to him shook his head and said, "It doesn't look like a disciple of the capital. Where did he buy those poems from?" Some people in the crowd couldn't help but say, "These 10 poems can be handed down from generation to generation. How can someone who can write such poems exchange them for money? Even if they are true, how can there be 10 of them at the same time?" Some people were dissatisfied and said, "You mean, he wrote this himself, which is even more ridiculous. Each of these 10 poems has a very different style. It cannot be written by one person." "That's because you don't know who he is." A figure stood out from the crowd, shook his head and said, "This is not the first time he has done such a thing." Someone in the crowd looked at him and said in surprise, "Brother Zilu, does he know that person?" Zheng Zilu looked in the direction of a certain room and nodded. He was commended by His Majesty's imperial edict. On the same day, he wrote, "Don't be afraid of your bones being broken into pieces, you must leave your innocence in the world, and I'm too lazy to paint Ime and put on makeup. Qi Ling Zhoujiwen, Tang Ning." "What, he is Tang Ning?" "Yes, but he only wrote 2 poems that day. These 10 poems today, how could there be such a person?" "You don't know him." Zheng Zilu shook his head and said, "I guess he only wrote 2 poems that day. I'm afraid it's because, for the state examination, he only had to write 2 poems. He can switch back and forth between boldness and elegance when writing poems and lyrics. He can speak to the eternal past just like eating and drinking water. He sometimes fights on the battlefield, sometimes retreats to the countryside, sometimes travels with his wife, sometimes his husband dies, that is, less unacceptable. On the night of Shangyuan, there is not only a poetry meeting, but also performances." While Zheng Zilu from Lingzhou was talking endlessly about Tang Jiwen's heroic deeds below, Xiaoju walked out of the room, occupied a table by himself, and watched the dance on the stage with interest. A figure walked over from the side. When he approached, he cupped his hand and said with a smile, "Young Master Xiao." It turns out to be the second young master Tang. Xiaoju glanced at him and asked casually, "Do you want to see me for anything?" Tang Zhao smiled and asked, "Are you familiar with Mr. Xiao and the leader of tonight's poetry club?" Xiaoju glanced at him and said, "Brother Tang, I met you yesterday. Why, you don't think he stole your limelight and want to take revenge on him, right?" Tang Zhao did not answer his question, looked at Xiaoju and said, "For the sake of young Master Xiao, please stay away from him." Xiaoju narrowed his eyes, looked at him, and asked, "Tang Zhao, what do you mean?" "Young Master Xiao knows what I mean." Tang Zhao smiled and said, "By the way, this is also what our Tang family means." "Tang family?" Xiaoju looked at him with a slightly strange expression. "Tang Ning is just a student from out of town who came to Beijing to take the exam. What does he have to do with the Tang family of the capital?" And judging from Tang Zhao's appearance, it seems that he and the Tang family have some grudge. But he was only surprised for a moment. Tang Zhao could not understand the pain he had suffered over the years. Tang Zhao didn't know what it felt like to be a Juran who didn't deserve the name. Tang Zhao didn't even know what it was like to go to a brothel and call 10 girls, only to have them feed mosquitoes. Tang Zhao didn't know, but Tang Ning knew. Not only did Tang Ning know, but she was also the only hope to save him from suffering. Now someone wants to cut off his only hope. The second young master of the Tang family, everyone who stands in his way, even the emperor, must die. Tang Zhao looked at Xiao Ju and said with a smile, please give me some face, Mr. Xiao, for this matter. Xiao Ju is our son, he knows what the right choice is, and he also knows how important a friend he just met is compared to the Tang family. Your face. Xiao Ju stood up, looked at him with a smile, and asked, who are you? The smile on Tang Zhao's face gradually solidified. He looked at Xiao Ju, his expression gradually darkened, but it was more of confusion and disbelief. What he said had been made very clear. Xiao Ju actually wanted to fall out with him and the Tang family because of a so-called friend he had just met for a day. Xiao Ju waved his hand impatiently and said, if you have nothing to do, stay away from me and don't disturb me watching the show. Okay, very good. Tang Zhao looked at him deeply, squeezed out a few words through his teeth, and turned to leave. Xiao Ju looked at his leaving figure, a look of confusion appeared on his face again, and murmured, what is the relationship between him and the Tang family? After thinking for a while, he looked upstairs and said, it's been almost an hour. What's going on? It's been so long. Like him, the eyes of many people in the hall glanced at the door of a room on the second floor from time to time. That guy, what are you doing in there with Miss Su? Snapped. Tang Ning slapped a thin piece of wood on the table, smiled at Su Mei, and said, what a fool. Su Mei had lost her ladylike image. She crossed her legs and looked at him suspiciously, why do you always win? Did you hide your cards? Tang Ning stood up, turned over her sleeves for her to see, and said, if you can't afford to lose, don't play. Anyway, time is almost up. Su Mei slapped the table and said, 3 more rounds. Tang Ning sat down again and reminded him, put some notes on it first. Su Mei already had a lot of notes on her forehead. Looking at Tang Ning who didn't have any, she said tenderly, I've already put so many on it. Just give me one chance. If she had acted like a spoiled child just now, Tang Ning might have been a little bit reluctant, but now the notes on her forehead were almost covering her face. How could she be so charming? Tang Ning looked at him, shook his head, and said, I'll accept the loss. Su Mei took a deep breath, put another note on it, and gritted her teeth and said, begin. If there is nothing to do for an hour, playing mahjong is a good way to kill time. This is the mahjong for 2 people he made with thin wood slices when he was bored on the road. It is larger than the mahjong of later generations and more like playing cards. He and the old beggar were bored on the road to kill time. This Miss Su was very smart and learned it quickly. In the last 3 games, Su Mei lost 2 games in a row. In the last game, she was more careful. She drew a card, looked at Tang Ning, and put it down carefully, Nanfan. Bang. Tang Ning took back her Nanfan and played a card casually, 60,000. Haha, Su Mei jumped up from the chair and laughed without caring about her manners, just waiting for your 60,000, who? Su Mei put one hand on her waist, looked at him and said, it's your turn to put it. Tang Ning put a piece of paper on his forehead, and when he stood up, he took it off and said, time is up, Miss Su, see you again if we are lucky. He bowed to Su Mei and turned to walk out of the room. Su Mei watched him walk out, took off the paper on her face, sat on the chair, and raised the corners of her mouth slightly. A figure walked out from the inner room and said, Miss, there are news from several states that need your review. You also need to reply to the invitation from Prince Duan as soon as possible. Su Mei's smile faded, and a trace of fatigue and hidden disgust appeared on her face. She rubbed her eyebrows, closed her eyes, and said, put it down, I'll take a look later. The old woman looked at her and spoke again, this person. Interesting. Su Mei opened her eyes and said, I haven't met such an interesting person for a long time. When Tang Ning walked downstairs, the number of people in the hall had obviously decreased a lot. Almost everyone's eyes were focused on him. Xiaoju stood up and walked over. Just as he was about to speak, he seemed to have discovered something and looked at his torn collar. He was stunned for a moment, and then his face showed envy. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 135. Xiaoju looked away from his torn skirt and said, "You guys, what we were talking about just now, was quite intense." They actually didn't talk much. In the room just now, Sumei played a song for him first, and then the two of them have been playing cards until now. Originally, he wanted to play some exciting games of flying chess, but when Sumei picked up the dice and shook it casually a few times, he gave up the idea. When it comes to shaking the sieve, perhaps only Tang Yaoyao is her opponent. However, the process of playing cards was quite intense. Sumei went from not understanding the rules to becoming familiar with the routines, and became more and more into the state. Tang Ning's victory in the next few games was very doubtful, and the last one even made her overturn. This involved there are many psychological battles, which are extremely tense and exciting. "Okay, it's getting late. If you don't go back, the old man at home will be nagging you." Xiaoju waved to him and said, "I'll come see you tomorrow." Tang Ning thought for a while and said, "Not tomorrow. I have to study tomorrow. I have to take the provincial exam soon, so I have to hurry up." Li Tianlan walked over and said, "I'll go find you tomorrow morning." "Okay." Tang Ning nodded and said, "Come here early tomorrow and I'll ask them to prepare a breakfast for you." In the bustling streets of the capital, Xiaofu followed Xiaoju for a long time and finally couldn't help but ask, "Young master, does this young master Tang's identity seem to be unusual?" "What does that have to do with anything?" Xiaoju crossed his hands and put them behind his head, and said nonchalantly, "I regard him as a friend, not because of his family background, but just friends with similar temperaments, no matter what his status is." Xiaofu thought for a while and said, "But the temperaments of the young master and Mr. Tang seem to be very different." "Are you doubting me?" Xiaoju turned around, kicked his butt angrily, and asked, "What kind of identity am I, Xiaoju? Am I capable of plotting against him?" Xiaofu patted his butt and asked doubtfully, "I heard Mr. Tang said some secret book." "Do you care?" Xiaoju kicked his butt again and said angrily, "From now on, you are not allowed to speak. If you say one more word, your legs will be broken." Xiaoju put his hands behind his head again. Thinking of Tang Ning's damaged skirt, a thoughtful expression appeared on his face. After a moment, he couldn't help but ask, "What did he and Miss Su do during that hour?" No one answered. Xiaoju frowned and asked, "Where did you die?" Xiaofu hurriedly ran in front of him and said, "It's the young master who doesn't let me speak." Xiaoju thought for a while and kicked him on the butt, "Then you still say it?" "The capital, a brothel somewhere." Lu Li knocked on the door, pushed the door open and went in. He didn't dare to look at the figure on the bed, lowered his head and said, "Second young master, someone saw them entering the Red Sleeve Pavilion. No wonder we searched all the inns and couldn't find it." "Hongxiu Pavilion," Tang Zhao looked calm and asked, "Hongxiu Pavilion is not an inn, so why can they hide in Hongxiu Pavilion?" Lu Li lowered his head and said, "I have asked Chang Yu to check." "No need to check." Tang Zhao waved his hand and said, "I don't want to know how he lived in Hongxiu Pavilion. Now that I have found him, you know what to do in the future, right?" Lu Li nodded immediately and said, "Don't worry, second young master, I will make arrangements as soon as possible." Tang Zhao waved his hand, and Lu Li immediately exited, closing the door behind him. He stood outside the door and breathed a long sigh of relief. "Tang Ning." He murmured the name, looked back again, and turned to leave. After shopping for most of the night yesterday, it was already midnight when I returned to Hongxiu Pavilion. On the night of the Shang Yuan dynasty, there were also many guests in Hongxiu Pavilion. Although it was not as good as Tianrunju, the two places were different types of places. The elegance of Tianrunju was only reflected in the couplet, while the elegance of Hongzhiyuj Pavilion, it is truly elegant and the environment is quiet and peaceful, just like a paradise in the noisy capital city. Like Tianashanju, Hongzhiyuj Pavilion was also open for business last night. After Tang Ning went to bed last night, the sound of silk and bamboo kept lingering in his ears, which kept him from falling asleep very late. But he didn't stay in bed in the morning. He made an appointment with Li Tianlan for breakfast today, and then helped him with tutoring and policy making. As soon as Shang Yuan passed, he had to prepare well for the provincial examination. Hongzhou Pavilion was busy all night yesterday. It will be closed for the day today and will not welcome guests again until tomorrow morning. Although he didn't have to entertain guests, when he went downstairs, he saw that the girls in the building had also gotten up early. When Tang Ning came down the stairs, they all looked at him. He couldn't help but pause in his steps. The first thought in his mind was whether his face had not been washed clean. He also thought that he had looked carefully when he came out just now and there should be no dirt, so he walked down with confidence. Shopkeeper Su stepped forward and said apologetically, "Sir, did I disturb you last night?" Tang Ning shook her head and said, "It's okay, isn't Miss Li here yet?" Shopkeeper Su shook his head and said, "Not yet." Peng Chen and the old beggar had already gotten up to have breakfast, which made Tang Ning a little embarrassed. He was the last one to get up every day. "Sir, have some tea." As soon as he sat down, a woman came over and helped him fill his teacup. "Thank you." Tang Ning nodded to her. The girl in Hongzhiyuj Pavilion was a prostitute rather than a prostitute. This girl named Chu Chu had served him tea and water and said a few words in the past 2 days. After she helped Tang Ning fill his cup with water, she did not leave but stood behind him. Tang Ning looked back at her and said, "Miss Chu Chu, go and do your thing. If there is anything, I can do it myself." Miss Chu Chu looked at him and suddenly took out a small booklet from her sleeve. She looked at him and smiled and said, "Mr. Tang, can you write your name on it?" Tang Ning looked at her in confusion. Was she asking for his signature? Although signatures have existed since ancient times and were not invented by later generations, he was not a celebrity or a great calligrapher. What was the point of asking for his signature? He opened the booklet and found that the booklet contained the 10 poems from yesterday. In addition, the 2 poems Lime Chant and Bodhisattva Man were also included. The poems that were published last night were actually in a booklet after only 1 night. "Okay, Chu Chu, you dare to eat alone behind our backs." A dissatisfied voice came from the back, and another woman came over, glared at Miss Chu Chu, and when she looked at Tang Ning, she smiled and said, "Mr. Tang, can you help me sign one too? I want one too, I want one too. And me." A series of crisp and tender voices came, and Tang Ning was instantly drowned in waves of fragrance. The old beggar looked up and saw Tang Ning sitting opposite him, but he could no longer see him. His face showed envy, he drank the wine in the glass, smacked his lips, and sighed. Not far away, shopkeeper Su was sitting at the counter watching this scene, and shook his head with some regret. On the night of the Lantern Festival, it was not only Tianrunju that used poetry gatherings as a gimmick. Hongzhou Pavilion also had a Lantern Festival poetry gathering. The champion of the poetry gathering would be treated with certain preferential treatment by Hongzhou Pavilion. But the champion of the poetry contest selected by Hongzhou Pavilion last night was far inferior to that young Master Tang. The comparison of poems is not limited to major poetry contests. On the night of the Lantern Festival, people will make a general ranking of the poems circulated in major poetry contests. It is very likely that the works of the champion of a poetry contest will not even be qualified to be on the list. But one person's works occupy the top 10, which is also unprecedented in history. This is enough to make him famous in the capital overnight. What a pity. Shopkeeper Su shook his head. Obviously they are his own people, but those good poems eventually fell into the hands of Tianrunju. Even if he gave them 1 or 2 poems. There was some regret on his face. He took out a pen and paper and started writing a letter. He needed to confirm the identity of this young Master Tang and report his actions in the capital in the past few days. Although he had only been in the capital for 2 days, he had already become famous on the night of the Lantern Festival with 10 poems handed down from generation to generation. Within a few days, his name would spread throughout the capital. In addition, he also won the opportunity to spend an hour alone with Miss Sumai Su, a famous beauty in the capital, which made others envious. I don't know what they did in that hour. Also, he has a friend in the capital. He and Miss Li seem to have a close relationship. What's the girl's name? I think it's Li Tianlan. Yes, it should be Li Tianlan. After writing, shopkeeper Su sealed the envelope, walked out of the counter, handed it to a clerk, and said, "This letter will be sent to Lingzhou as soon as possible." You are listening to Novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 136. In Tang Ning's room in Hengzhou Pavilion, Li Tianlan put down one of his policy papers and said, "During this period, you have indeed made great progress. If you can maintain this level even above the provincial examination, even if the article cannot add color to your policy papers. But it won't be called bullshit. It is necessary to make progress. Otherwise, during those 2 months, Zhongyi would tutor him in the room until late at night every day. Wouldn't it be a waste of time? Your 10 Shangyuan poems have been spread in the capital." Li Tianlan looked at him and suddenly asked, "Do you know what people outside call you?" Tang Ning was stunned for a moment and asked uncertainly, "Shixian." Li Tianlan glanced at him, "Is your last name Li Tebe?" Tang Ning thought for a while and asked, "Isn't he the poet saint?" Li Tianlan looked at him and said, "They call you Shi Madman." Tang Ning's expression was stunned. Li Bai is known as the immortal of poetry, Du Fu is known as the saint of poetry, Wang Wei is honored as the Buddha of poetry, and although Bai Juyi's poetic demon sounds not as elegant as the first 3, no matter how you say it, it is still an honorific title, right? What the hell is poetry maniac? How come it's only 2 words for others, but it becomes 3 words for him? They say that although you have poetic talent, you write poetry for the sake of writing poetry. The content and artistic conception of the poem are just imagined. They also said that your behavior is degrading and is not conducive to the development of poetry. They say only madmen write poetry like this. Li Tianlan helped him with policy counseling while telling him what he saw on the road. Jealousy, this is naked jealousy. Tang Ning didn't even bother to explain that Wen Tingyun's good writing about boudoir love does not mean that she must be a woman. Wang Xiu can control both boldness and elegance, and has achieved extremely high achievements in both styles of poetry. Who said that poetry must reflect oneself? He described, "Isn't it okay for a general who has been fighting for many years to reflect a poor woman who misses her late husband? Do you think that if you want to write about a woman's love affair, you must first practice the Sunflower Manual and the Sword Manual to ward off evil? If you want to write about border wars, you have to go into battle and kill the enemy yourself? Xiaoju is a young boy, but when it comes to the secrets in the brothel, isn't he like a veteran of flowers? By the same token, he only showed off a small part of the splendid Chinese civilization behind him. Why should they call him crazy?" He looked at Li Tianlan and said angrily, "They have gone too far." Li Tianlan shook his head and said, "I think poetry madman suits you quite well." Tang Ning looked at her and frowned, "Do you think you can talk like that? Or are you no longer brothers? A royal palace, a deep palace somewhere." Emperor Chen put down a letter and murmured, "Emperor Chu sent someone to send an urgent report." Those guys on the grassland are restless again. Your Majesty, don't worry, a voice came from behind him, saying, Yunzhou has hundreds of thousands of elite soldiers stationed all year round. Those barbarians can't make any trouble. Those who underestimated that group of barbarians will suffer a big loss in the end. Emperor Chen shook his head and said, but fortunately, those group of barbarians are not peaceful. Some people like me can't sleep. I heard that Emperor Chu has been in poor health in recent days. It's not very good, I don't know if it's true or not. He put down the book in his hand, stretched out, shook his head and said, that's all, let's not talk about it. Wei Jian, tell me if there is anything interesting happening in the capital these days. After eunuch Wei thought for a while, he said, Your Majesty, Tang Ning has come to Beijing. Tang Ning, Chen Huang thought for a while and asked, this name sounds familiar. Who is he? Eunuch Wei coughed lightly and reminded, Your Majesty, this Tang Jiwen has saved 500,000 taels of silver for the national treasury since the beginning of this year. You also rewarded him with a jade belt. A look of surprise appeared on Chen Wang's face. It turns out to be him. He looked at Wei Jian and asked, the provincial examination is about to begin. Naturally, he has to come to Beijing to take the examination. What is this interesting thing? Your Majesty doesn't know something. Wei Jian smiled and said, there was a poetry meeting in Beijing yesterday, and Tang Jiwen also participated. Your Majesty, what do you think happened to him? Chen Huang thought for a while and said, I remember that he wrote good poems. Why, could it be that he wrote another good poem last night? Is this the interesting thing you said? Wei Jian smiled and said, of course one poem is not an interesting thing. Last night he wrote 10 poems in total. Those 10 poems are all the top 10 poems judged by Jingzhong during this Lantern Festival. Emperor Chen was surprised and said, the top 10 are actually monopolized by him. Wei Jian said, it is said that the cause was Tang Qi, the son of Master Tang. Before the Lantern Festival, he sent people to buy 10 poems, hoping to win the first place in one fell swoop. Later, Tang Jiwen wrote 10 poems by himself, allowing Tang, Your Excellency's young master has never even made a list and has become the laughing stock of the capital. This Tang Jiwen is probably not someone who is easily bullied, and because of the poems he wrote, people outside call him a poetry madman. So, this man's poetic talent should be unique in the world. Chen Huang nodded and said, I would like to see what poems he wrote last night. Wei Jian bowed and said, slave, let someone get it right now. Not long after, a pamphlet appeared in Chen Huang's hand. After he flipped through it, the expression on his face began to become strange. He put down the booklet after a long time and couldn't help but said, only the wrong name, not the wrong nickname. The poetry madman really deserves his reputation. This Tang Ning, really he, is really a talent. Wei Jian smiled and said, I wonder how he will perform in this provincial exam. I envy him a little. Emperor Chen looked outside the palace and said, thousands of years later, people may remember him for these poems, but they may not remember me. Wei Jian hurriedly stepped forward and said, Your Majesty is as wise and brave as the Tang and Song dynasties. It is because of the prosperity under your rule that there are talents like Tang Jiwen. People will naturally remember Your Majesty. Forget it, I can't even take care of things before my death, how can I take care of things after my death? Emperor Chen waved his hand and asked, how is the health of concubine Shu, is it better? Wei Jian bowed and said, Your Majesty, don't worry, the imperial physician went to see her yesterday and said that concubine Shu's illness is not serious. She will be fine after taking a few doses of medicine and resting for a few days. That's good. Emperor Chen nodded and said, accompany me to see concubine Shu. Wei Jian raised his head and said loudly, Your Majesty, get going. Tang family. The woman named Tang Shui quietly walked into a courtyard, closed the gate, walked quickly into a room, looked at the woman in the room, and said happily, Aunt, I found him again. "And, you can't guess what happened last night." The woman held her hand and said, "In a few days, everyone in the capital will know his name. Humph, those people outside actually said he was a poetry madman, they are all jealous." The woman held her hand and asked hurriedly, "What happened last night?" Tang Shui smiled and said, "Last night at the Lantern Festival poetry meeting in Tianrunju." She shook her head with some regret and said, "If I had known, I would have gone to Tianrunju last night, but it doesn't matter, I have already found out clearly that he lives in Hongxiu Pavilion. No wonder I couldn't find him after searching all the inns in the capital." After listening to him, the woman's face showed a trace of relief, but more of worry. She looked at the young woman in front of her and said, "Shui-er, I want to ask you a favor." The woman knew what she was thinking and nodded, "Don't worry, little girl, I won't bother him, and I won't let anyone bully him." Xiaoju didn't bother him in the morning, and Li Tianlan stayed in his room for an hour before leaving. Tang Ning went downstairs and saw a waiter from Hongxiu Pavilion carrying a bag, as if he was going out, and Manager Su was telling him something. "Where are you going?" Tang Ning asked casually. Manager Su smiled and said, "He has something to do in Lingzhou." Tang Ning was stunned and said, "It's just right, help me take a letter back and send it to County Magistrate Zhong's house." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 137. Before leaving, his mother-in-law gave many instructions to him to write a letter home as soon as possible after arriving in the capital. Writing a letter is not difficult, but sending it is somewhat difficult. After all, this is not the future where cars and horses are very slow and letters are far away. If there is anything that cannot be solved with a phone call or a WeChat message, even at the post station that can only be used by government communications, the speed is far inferior to that of SF Express. If ordinary people send letters, they basically have to rely on fellow villagers to send them. Fortunately, the Tang family has a great business, and its business is spread all over Chen State, the capital, and Lingzhou. There will be correspondence every once in a while, and it can usually arrive in 7 or 8 days. If it is urgent, his letter can be delivered to Xiru by the day after tomorrow. And Xiaoai's hand. The Lantern Festival has passed, and the capital has returned to its original appearance. Although it is still much more prosperous than Lingzhou, it is not as exaggerated as the 2 days of the Lantern Festival. Originally, he planned to wait until after the Lantern Festival to visit Fang Mansion first, and then inform Li Tianlan that he had arrived in Beijing. But since Miss Li came to him first, he only needed to go to Fang Mansion to say hello. When Tang Ning thought of Fang Mansion, she thought of Fang Xiaopang. I don't know how she is doing in Lingzhou. Although he has only left for half a month, her determination to lose weight is extremely determined and she has never fallen behind in her actions. She can see obvious changes in half a month. Maybe, when he returns to Lingzhou after the provincial examination, he won't be able to recognize her. After the Lantern Festival, order was restored in Beijing, and officials from various departments in the DPRK had to return to their respective positions and perform their duties. Tang Ning only knew Fang Hong in the Fang Mansion, so she deliberately chose to go there in the afternoon after going to the office. At this time, Fang Hong should be at home. He took Peng Chen out with him. Along the way, the old beggar got bored, so he taught Peng Chen his martial arts. Judging from his growing respect for the old beggar, he should have benefited a lot. The old beggar occupied a table in the corner by himself. On the table were several dishes to go with wine. While eating the food and drinking, he also watched the performances of the girls, squinting his eyes and looking extremely happy. When Tang Ning was about to go out, he turned around, looked at him and said, "I've been eating and drinking your food and living in your house these days. I feel really bad about it. I'll teach you a few tricks when I have time. You can practice more and you'll pass. In the past 2 or 3 years, although it is still impossible to defeat your little sweetheart, I will not be bullied by her casually." Tang Ning shook her head and said, Senior, don't feel bad. You can just drink, eat, and live here. We can talk about this later, let's go out first. The old beggar still had principles in doing things. Although Tang Ning hoped that he would stay by his side and be a bodyguard who only took care of food, drink, and living, but if he could give him some pointers, he would be able to fight in 2 years. He would not refuse Tang Yaoyao. After all, he wanted to beat Tang Yaoying to avenge his humiliation, and it was no longer just a day or two. Most of the officials and dignitaries in the capital live in the same area. You can find out the residence of Fang Shilang of the Ministry of Civil Affairs by just asking anyone. As far as the eye can see, this area is full of wealthy families, and the Fang family's house is not conspicuous on this street. Fang Hong was the minister of the Ministry of Personnel. Although his official rank was high, it was not the highest. However, the influence of the Fang family in the capital was huge, and even the minister of the Ministry of Personnel could not compare with it. This is not only because the Fang family was once prominent in the capital. When the old man was still alive, he had disciples all over the world. Even now, there are countless officials and dignitaries in the capital who have good relations with the Fang family. It is also because concubine Shu, who is extremely favored by the emperor today, she is the daughter of the Fang family. When they walked to the door of Fang Mansion, a concierge came up and said politely, "You two, what is the important matter for you to come to Fang Mansion?" Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "Is Mr. Fang at home?" The porter looked at him and asked, "Young master, are you coming to Beijing from Lingzhou to take the exam?" Tang Ning nodded. The porter smiled and said, "My lord hasn't returned home yet, but I guess he will soon. You two, please go to the mansion and have a cup of tea. I will report back when my lord comes back." Tang Ning followed him into Fang Mansion. As the servant walked, he said, "There are quite a few students from Lingzhou who come to visit me these days. You are quite late." He took Tang Ning and Tang Ning to a side hall and said, "You two have a cup of tea here first and wait for a while. My lord will be back soon." "Excuse me." Tang Ning nodded and found a seat to sit down. There was some noise outside, the sound of children. Just as Tang Ning took a sip of tea, she saw a sepak takraw ball flying in from the outside. Then, a boy of 8 or 9 years old ran in from the outside and kicked the sepak takraw ball out. Just as he was about to run out, he suddenly looked at Tang Ning. After a moment's pause, he pointed at him and said angrily, "It's you, why did you come to our house?" Tang Ning had some impressions of this young man. He seems to be called Fang Xintheng, Fang Hong's youngest son, the boy who bullied Fang Xiaopang at the gate of Fang's house and was beaten until he burst into tears by her. When Fang Xintheng saw Tang Ning, it was as if he saw an enemy. After shouting, he ran out angrily. After a while, several figures ran in with a hurrah. Enemies are extremely jealous when they meet. He looked at the boy next to him who was obviously 2 or 3 years older than him, pointed at Tang Ning, and said angrily, "Cousin, he was the one who instigated Fang Xinyu to beat us in the first place. You guys are so useless. You can't even beat a girl." The boy looked at them with disdain, then walked forward, looked up at Tang Ning, and said arrogantly, "You bullied my cousin." This young man was not very tall, but he was much stronger than Fang Xintheng and the others. Of course, he was still a bit smaller than the fat Fang Xiaopang. Tang Ning had never bullied Fang Xintheng, and he had never even touched him. He looked at the boy, shook his head and said, "It's not me." The boy was stunned when he heard it, turned back to look at Fang Xintheng, and whispered, "He said it's not me, did you recognize the wrong person?" "It's him." Fang Xintheng pointed at Tang Ning and said, "If he hadn't said that he would give Fang Xinyu some 4 joy meatballs and assorted pots, Fang Xinyu wouldn't have hit us." The boy looked at Tang Ning, his throat moved a few times, and asked, "What pot?" "I heard others passing on those 10 poems this morning, and I knew you were coming to the capital." Fang Hong strode in from outside and said with a smile, The Ministry of Personnel has just opened today, and there are a lot of things to do. I'm sorry to have kept you waiting. Tang Ning smiled and said, "It's okay, I just came a while." Fang Xintheng saw Fang Hong coming in and immediately bowed his head and said, "Dad." Uncle the boy also spoke at the same time. Fang Hong looked at them and asked, "What are you doing here?" Fang Xintheng and several other boys held the rattan ball and dispersed, but the sturdy boy stayed. "This is His Royal Highness Prince Ran." Fang Hong pointed at the young man and introduced him. The concubine Shu has been feeling unwell these days, so she sent him to the Fang mansion. Tang Ning didn't expect that the young man was actually a prince. He casually bowed and said, "Meet His Royal Highness Prince Ran." "No need to be polite." The young man looked at him, put his hands behind his back, and said, "Don't leave for a while, I have something to ask you." After that, he turned around and walked out swaggeringly. After the young man walked out, Fang Hong looked at Tang Ning and smiled, "I have known for a long time that Lingzhou and the capital are no different to you. You just came to the capital and made such a big fuss." Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "Did Lord Fang hear about it too?" Fang Hong smiled and said, "After the Lantern Festival, who doesn't know that there is a crazy poet in the capital?" The title of crazy poet doesn't sound like a compliment at all. Tang Ning smiled awkwardly, chatted with Fang Hong about some family matters, drank a few sips of tea, and planned to leave. After all, he came to Fang Mansion today just out of courtesy, and there was not much to talk about between him and Fang Hong. After drinking a cup of tea, he felt that there was nothing to say. When he left Fang Mansion, he did not see the king run again. He went directly back to Hungzhou Pavilion. As soon as he stepped in, he noticed that countless eyes were looking at him. Tang Ning paused, looked at shopkeeper Su, and asked in confusion, "What's wrong?" As soon as the voice fell, a voice that made people's bones tingle sounded in his ears. A figure in front turned around, looked at Tang Ning, and said softly, "Mr. Tang, I have been waiting for you for a long time." Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 138. Everyone has their own characteristics that are different from ordinary people. For example, Tang Yao Yao has long legs, Fang Xiaopang has a wide body, and Zhong Yi's gentleness can be heard in his voice. Su Mei's characteristic is that she is charming, both in person and in her voice. She can make people's bones feel numb and the soles of their feet feel weak after hearing her words. Especially when she didn't call herself mother but called herself slave, she was charming to the core. Tang Ning was helpless against such a whining voice, but instead of being fascinated by her, she felt chills all over and had goosebumps all over her body when she heard it. The girls in Hungzhou Pavilion all looked at Su Mei with wary eyes, including shopkeeper Su's eyes that looked at her with a hint of defensiveness. Several of the waiters' faces turned red, and they only dared to peek at her from time to time. Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "What are you doing here?" The guys in Hungzhou Pavilion all stared at him with wide eyes. "Who is Su Mei?" "She is the most beautiful woman in the capital and the head shopkeeper of Tianranju. Normally, other men would not have a chance to talk to her." "Mr. Tang, but it's true that you don't know how to cherish the beauty at all." The girls not far away looked at Tang Ning with a different look. They were satisfied with a hint of fondness, while looking at Su Mei, they were filled with pride. Su Mei lowered her head and said aggrievedly, "Last night in Nujia's room, I was still calling Nujia Meyer. Have you forgotten Nujia today? Who called her Mayer last night, Ching or Mayer? Anyone with ER in their nickname is his nemesis. One destroys his innocence, and the other, also destroys his innocence. Shopkeeper Su is still here. If she continues to talk about how they played a tense and exciting game between two people last night, and there was a pa-pa-pa sound during the process, he is worried that Fairy Tang will not be able to pass. In a few days, she would carry Xiru and Xiaoai's expectations with her and her 30-meter long sword from Lingzhou to the capital. He couldn't let her act like a monster anymore. Tang Ning looked at her and said calmly, "If there's anything you need, Miss Su, please go upstairs and talk." Su Mei nodded shyly and said, "Let's go to your room and talk slowly." The old beggar looked at the two people walking upstairs with envy on his face. Then he turned to look at Peng Chen and said, "Have you seen it? Learn from him. If you were as good as him, you wouldn't be without a few good friends now, and you can't even get a wife." Peng Chen thought for a while, looked at him and asked, "Where is the old man's wife?" I can be like you," the old beggar snorted coldly and said, "I have been among flowers for decades, and I have never touched a leaf on my body. I have never even touched the hands of a woman like you. The chicken is different. But you still don't have a wife. And you're so old. I will never find a wife in my life. 100 years from now, there will be no one to accompany me on the road to hell." Tang Ning returned to her room, closed the door, turned to look at Su Mei and asked, "What exactly do you want to do?" The moment the door closed, the charming expression on Su Mei's face instantly disappeared. She sat on a chair, crossed her legs and said, "Where are your cards? Take them out and play a few." Tang Ning looked at her, confused. "You came to me just to play cards?" He really couldn't figure it out. Su Mei came to Hongxiu Pavilion, pretending to be gentle and pretending to be abandoned by the chaos, just to play cards with him. Su Mei glanced at her and asked, "What if I want to sleep with you?" Tang Ning was stunned, looked at her and said, "Girl, please be more reserved when you speak." Su Mei rolled her eyes at her, "Reserved? I almost vomit when I pretend to be reserved. Hurry up, mother-in-law and mother-in-law, I only have a little time and I have to leave soon." Tang Ning now understood that he had misunderstood Yao Yao all along. Tang Yao Yao was not a demon, but Su Yao Yao was the real demon. He sat down opposite Su Mei and said, "How about I give you the cards and you find someone else to play with? This is Hongxiu Pavilion after all, not a natural residence. Maybe one of the girls is Tang Yejing's spy." When he and Su Mei are in the same room in Hongxiu Pavilion, he always has the feeling that Tang Yejing will jump out at any time to catch someone raping him. "There's no point in fighting them." Su Mei waved her hand and said, "Hurry up. If you are in a bad mood in the future, you can come to me and I will play the flute for you for free." Su Mei's Xiao Sheng has a kind of magical power. Although it will evoke many emotions hidden deep in the heart during the process, after listening to it, you will indeed feel much more relaxed. It is simply a must-have artifact for reducing stress. Tang Ning thought about it and realized that this deal couldn't be more cost-effective. So he nodded and said, "Okay." In the Red Sleeve Pavilion, shopkeeper Su looked up at a closed door upstairs, a trace of doubt appeared on his face, and murmured, "What is Su Mei doing here?" The old beggar also put his eyes in front of the door, turned to look at Peng Chen, and asked, "That shouldn't be the case. In addition to being younger than me, is there any other way that Mr. Tang is better than me? Why is he so good looking? Are all the women moving towards him?" Peng Chen looked at him but said nothing. "You think so too, don't you?" As soon as the old beggar finished speaking, he saw the door open, and after being startled, he said, "And he's so fast." Tang Ning couldn't understand that Su Mei went to such great lengths just to play 3 games of mahjong with him. Gambling is harmful to people, and it is also terrible for women to become addicted to it. Su Mei walked down and when she turned around, she smiled brightly at him and said, "Young Master Tang, I will come to see you in a few days." Su Mei twisted her waist and left. The old beggar came up to him, looked him up and down, and asked suspiciously, "What are you doing upstairs?" "Play cards. That little girl is so good at charming, she can't even charm you." The old beggar looked at him, then at Xiao Ju who walked in, shook his head and said, "Physical diseases are easy to cure, but mental diseases are easy to cure, but it's difficult to cure." "What's the disease?" Xiao Ju stepped forward and asked. I saw Miss Su walking out just now. Why did she come to Hangzhou Pavilion? Isn't she here to find you? After a while, Xiaoju looked at Tang Ning with admiration on his face. If 1 hour last night was just a reward from the leader of the poetry club, then 1 day later, Miss Su Mei took the initiative to come to the door, which was Tang Ning's charm. He suddenly discovered that there were many things he wanted to learn from him. He looked at Tang Ning and said solemnly, I, Xiaoju, have made your friend my friend. To hospital. After listening to what a young eunuch said, Ling Yuheng looked suspicious and murmured, that's not right. It is said that even if concubine Shu is not cured now, she should be much better. Why is her condition getting worse? Another middle-aged imperial doctor stepped forward, thought for a moment, and said, could it be a matter of dosage? Empress Shifei is weak. Even if the dosage has been reduced, it is still too much for the Empress. Otherwise, make it lighter. Ling Yuheng thought for a while and said, let's do this first, Mr. Chang, you and I will go into the palace and then check the pulse of concubine Shu. I always feel that even if the dosage of medicine is skipped, it shouldn't be like this result. The middle-aged imperial doctor nodded and said, that's fine. I just need to go into the palace to discuss this with Mr. Chen. After sending the eunuch away, Ling Yuheng took the prescription in his hand. After looking at it carefully, his eyes became even more suspicious and he murmured, it shouldn't be. You are listening to novels at Bless Up channel. Wish you happiness and luck. Please subscribe to receive new novels. How do you feel about this novel? Please like and leave a comment. Fortunate Young Gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 139. After sending Su Mei away, Tang Ning noticed that the girl from Red Sleeve Pavilion looked at him obviously differently. Not only are his eyes different, but his behavior is also different. Tang Ning was just planning to sit for a while and listen to the music, when several figures gathered around her. Young master, are you thirsty? I'll make you some tea. This was Chu Chu. Master, are you tired? Let me give you a shoulder squeeze. This is Ying Ying. Master, let me give you a leg kick. This was Jing Jing. The girls who didn't get the chance to make tea, squeeze their shoulders and beat their legs, had no choice but to retreat with expressions of disappointment and regret. No, no, I'm not tired, and I'm not thirsty either. Tang Ning quickly refused. As she spoke, 2 pairs of catkins appeared on her shoulders and legs. Ying Ying squeezed his shoulders and said, young master, please be careful. Su Mei is just like her name. She is a coquettish woman who only seduces men everywhere. You must not be fooled by her. Tang Ning nodded and said, don't worry, it won't happen. Their worries were completely unnecessary. In front of him, Su Mei had completely given up the burden of being a goddess and restored her true nature. He could not confuse her at all. But thinking about the way she crossed her legs to touch the cards, and the gentle and charming way she pretended to be in front of others, I'm afraid it would be very hard. The longer a person's nature is suppressed, the more channels are needed to vent it. Therefore, there are many people who appear bright on the surface, but when they are alone, they look completely different from what they appear in front of others. Su Mei probably belongs to this kind of person. The strange thing is that her way of relaxing is to play cards, and with him. Tang Ning could not have imagined that besides being good-looking, knowledgeable, hard-working, brave, mature, and humorous, he also what are the advantages? I wonder what exactly Su Mei likes about him. Xiaoju was sitting in the distance, looking in a certain direction. When he saw Tang Ning surrounded by stars like a moon, he couldn't help but ask Peng Chen, in terms of appearance, family background, temperament, what should I do, how is he inferior? Peng Chen didn't speak, just looked at him and lowered his eyes. After the Lantern Festival, the biggest event in the capital in the near future is the provincial examination held in early March. According to Li Tianlan, he actually didn't need to spend too much time preparing. After all, although his policy statement cannot be said to be a beautiful article, it will not lose points. At this level, it is difficult to improve further, let alone a qualitative change in just 1 month. However, despite what Miss Lee said, she still came on time the next day, had breakfast at Hungzhi Yuj Pavilion, helped him read the policy, and did not leave until noon. After lunch, Tang Ning walked in the backyard for a while and was about to go back to her room to take a nap. As soon as she walked in the back door, she saw the boy walking in from the front door. When the young man saw him, he strode over and said angrily, "You lied to me yesterday." Tang Ning looked at him and asked, "What did I lie to you about?" "I asked you not to leave yesterday." "But I didn't agree." The young man was stunned, looked at Tang Ning and asked, "I am the prince, why don't you agree?" "The prince also needs to be reasonable." Tang Ning looked at the naturally stupid fat man and said, "The prince is not a robber. When asking people to do things, you have to ask for their consent." The young man thought for a while and felt that what he said made sense. His father taught him this before, but no one except his father had ever said these words to him. The eunuchs and maids in the palace were all told by him. They just do whatever. But these are not important anymore. He looked up at Tang Ning and asked, "I heard Fang Xintheng say that you made a lot of delicious food for Fang Xinyu." "I ordered you, no, I asked you." He scratched his head and said, "Anyway, you have to do it for me." Tang Ning looked at him, shook her head and said, "But I can't cook." The young man was startled when he heard this and said, "But Fang Xintheng said." "Do you believe what Fang Xintheng said?" The young man seemed to have not figured out something. He tried his best to recall. Tang Ning looked at Fang Hong behind him and asked, "Why are Master Fang here?" "Send King Run back to the palace." Fang Hong looked at him and said, "He knew you were in Hungzhi Pavilion and insisted on coming in to take a look." Tang Ning nodded and asked casually, "Is concubine Shu feeling better?" Fang Hong shook his head and said, "Someone from the palace said that concubine Shu's condition has become more serious." Tang Ning was a little surprised. When Fang Hong mentioned this matter yesterday, he just mentioned it casually. Now it seems that the situation is not optimistic. No wonder Fang Hong seems to be in a low mood. Concubine Fang Shu is her biological sister and the Fang family's biggest supporter in Beijing. If something happens to her, the Fang family will undoubtedly be the most affected. Of course, simply as a relative, he would definitely be worried. Fang Hong sighed and said, "It would be great if Divine Doctor Sun was in the capital. I have already sent people to Lingzhou to ask for Divine Doctor Sunday." Tang Ning shook her head and said, "Mr. Sun left Lingzhou half a month ago. He said he was going on a long trip. Master Fang may not be able to invite him this time." "What?" Fang Hong's expression changed, with a look of disappointment on his face. When he saw Tang Ning, he seemed to have remembered something, and suddenly said, "Tang Jiwen is the younger brother of Divine Doctor Sunday." Tang Ning waved her hand and said, "Master Fang has misunderstood. I only know a little bit about medical skills, but I can't compare with Mr. Sunday. The palace has an imperial hospital, and the doctors in the hospital are all highly skilled. Tang Ning doesn't even need to think about the diseases that they are helpless against." Fang Hong sighed and said, "It's too late to return to the palace. His Majesty will blame me. I will take Prince Run back to the palace first. If you encounter any problems in the capital, you can send someone to Fang Mansion to let us know." Tang Ning nodded and sent Fang Hong and Prince Run out. The young man walked out of the door, looked back at him, and said, "Don't lie to me. If I find out that you lied to me, I will let my father beat you with a stick." Tang Ning walked back to Hungzhi Pavilion. The old beggar looked at him and said, "Let's go to Tianrunja for dinner tonight. It's free anyway, and their wine is not bad." The old beggar's interest in distilled wine is no longer as good as before. This kind of wine lacks mellowness, and anyone will get tired of it if they drink it too much. Although the old beggar can't be called tired, he has started to drink other kinds of wine again. Of course, although distilled wine is not as attractive to him as before, it seems that he intends to stay by his side. Tang Ning estimated that he was planning to treat him as a long-term free meal ticket and wine ticket. After all, in this era of moral decline, there are not many good people like him who respect the elderly and love the young, provide food, drink, accommodation, and watch beautiful women dancing. If you want to capture a man's heart, you must first capture his stomach. If you want someone to stay by your side, you must first let him form a habit. Although Tang Ning didn't want to face Su Mei, in order to cultivate the good habit of the old beggar asking for clothes and wine, he agreed without hesitation. The old beggar patted his shoulder with satisfaction and said, "Boy, I am doing this for your own good." The girl in Tianrunju is not only a 1 in a million natural charm, but also seems to have practiced charm skills, which is even rarer. She is simply the best among women. If you can win her, you will benefit a lot in the future. Tang Ning shook his head. He couldn't stand Su Mei calling him slave and old lady at one moment and old lady at another. Her charm was all fake. What the world saw was the false appearance she showed. Not everyone saw her as deeply as he did. Tianrunju, a small pavilion somewhere. A servant looked at the people in the elegant pavilion apologetically and said, "I'm sorry, Miss Su is not feeling well, so it's inconvenient for us to see you today. Please forgive me." "It's okay," a young man waved his hand and said, "since Miss Su is not feeling well, we can't bother her. Let's talk next time." The servant left, and someone in the pavilion laughed and said, "It seems that Brother Su's face is not big enough, and Miss Su is unwilling to come out." Another person shook his head and said, "After all, she is the most beautiful woman in the capital, how can she be so easy to see? The second son of the Tang family. I have asked for an audience several times, but I haven't met her alone. Miss Su doesn't even give face to the Tang family, so isn't it normal for her to not give face to the Marquis of Wuan Mansion?" At the window, a man turned around and said, "But if Miss Su goes to accompany someone else, it's not just a matter of not giving face, right?" The man pointed in a direction outside the window and said, "I just saw Miss Su walk into that elegant pavilion." A young man looked at him and asked, "Are you sure?" Lu Li nodded and smiled. It seems that Brother Su's face is really not big enough. Fortunate young gentleman. Author, Rong Xiao Rong. Chapter 140. The young man named Su Xiao looked a little unhappy. It would be fine if Su Mei didn't see him. After all, she rarely agreed to appointments with other people, and even if she did, it was just to show her face in front of others. But when he made an appointment to meet her, she became unwell and then went into someone else's room. Didn't this make it clear that Su Xiao was not qualified to meet her? Where should he put his face in front of these friends? Su Xiao looked at Lu Li and asked, "Who is in the room?" Lu Li shook his head and said, "I didn't see clearly. Maybe my eyes were wrong just now. Maybe that was not Miss Su Mei just now." He smiled and said, "Don't worry about this, everyone. Let's drink and eat. It's rare that Brother Su is treating us today, so don't be polite to him." Su Xiao knew it was Lu Li who was stepping down the steps for him. He sat back down and a servant standing behind him immediately filled his glass with wine. Su Xiao looked at the servant standing aside and said, "Stand at the door and watch to see if the person who comes out after a while is Su Mei." "Yes, sir." The servant nodded and immediately withdrew. In another room, when Su Mei filled up the wine for him with her own hands, Tang Ning picked up the wine glass, wondering whether he should drink it. He often beat her at cards, and often asked her to put notes on his face. Su Mei was talking about the humiliation she suffered today, and she would repay it in the future. She didn't know whether it meant on the poker field or some other field. This woman seemed to be the type to retaliate. Although she didn't poison his wine, She didn't know if she had added any ingredients secretly. After thinking about it carefully, she felt that it shouldn't be the case. Tang Ning took a sip and said, "Thank you, Miss Su. I can do it myself." The old beggar looked at his empty wine glass, shook his head, and poured it for himself. Su Mei looked at them and said, "You guys eat slowly. If you have anything to do, just tell the servants. I'll go down and get busy first." Tang Ning wanted her to leave as soon as possible and said, "Miss Su, go and do your work. Don't worry about us." Su Mei glanced at him and walked out of the room. The little maid behind her looked at her, thought for a moment, and asked, "Miss, why are you so nice to that guy?" Su Mei looked at her and asked, "Is there any?" The little maid nodded vigorously. "Be nice to him so that he can play cards with me." Su Mei sighed and said, "These days, there are not many people who can play cards with me." The little maid nodded in understanding. In another room, the servant walked into the room, walked up to Su Xiao, and whispered, "Master, the person who walked out of the room is indeed Miss Su Mai Su." Su Xiao picked up the wine glass, drank the wine in the glass, and asked, "Who is in the room?" The servant immediately said, "I have found out clearly that the person in the room is the leader of the Lantern Festival Poetry Club." The leader of the Lantern Poetry Club, that crazy poet. Su Xiao frowned, turned to look at the people on the table, and asked, "What is this person's background?" "I'm not sure about the specifics." Lu Li thought for a while and said, "It is said that he came from Lingzhou. He tried to solve the Yuan dynasty in the state and won the title from the second young master of Tang dynasty. He wrote very good poems." Lu Li looked at him and said, "Don't mess around. He was with young master Xiao that night. It is said that he is a friend of young master Xiao. There is no need to offend young master Xiao for someone who has nothing to do with him." Su Xiao smiled and said, "Don't worry, this is the capital, how could I mess up? Besides, I have nothing to do with offending young master Xiao. The small Wuan Marquis mansion cannot afford to offend Duke Dingguo mansion." After he finished speaking, he waved to a servant behind him, "Come here." The food in Tiantianju tasted really good. The old beggar let out a long wine burp, wiped his mouth carelessly with his sleeve, and lay down comfortably on the chair. After all, he was a martial arts master. Tang Ning once suggested to him that he should change his image and pay for the clothes, but the old beggar refused without even thinking about it. Later, Tang Ning let him go, but threatened him by saying that he had no wine to drink. He could be sloppy, but he couldn't be dirty, and he couldn't pick his feet while eating. Although the old beggar was reluctant, but his weakness was caught, he also had to give in. He still looks a little sloppy now, but he doesn't smell bad. However, his behavior of wiping his mouth with his sleeve may not be able to change for a while. Tang Ning shook her head and said, "Are you full? Come back when you are full." Although he could eat and drink for free in Tianatianju with the brand Su Mei gave him, but if he really relied on this brand to eat and drink here for free every day, the old beggar was shameless, and Tang Ning would still have to pay for it. From now on, she would come to Tianju less often for meals, which also meant she could have less entanglements with Su Mei. Tang Ning always felt that this woman was not that simple. He and the old beggar Peng Chen walked downstairs, and a young woman walked in outside the door. Tang Ning passed by the woman. The woman suddenly stopped and turned her head to look at him. Tang Ning saw a moment of hesitation in her eyes. But it was only for a moment. A moment later, the woman fell to the ground, hugging Tang Ning's legs, and said in a crying voice, "You heartless person, just leave at your word, how can we, mother and son, live?" At this time, almost every table downstairs was filled with guests. After the woman's sad voice sounded, countless eyes looked over at her. What happened? Who is that woman? That person seems to be the leader of the Lantern Festival Poetry Club, Lingzhou Yuan Tang Ning. He is the crazy poet. Everyone looked at this side with doubtful eyes. Tang Ning raised his eyebrows slightly, looked down at the woman, and asked, "Did the girl recognize the wrong person?" "Recognized the wrong person," the woman got up from the ground, pointed at him, and said disappointedly, "We promised to be together forever, how long has it been, and you don't recognize me?" Tang Ning looked at her and asked, "Do you know my name?" The woman looked at him and said, "Of course I remember, your name is Tang Ning." The girl really recognized the wrong person. Tang Ning looked at her, shook his head, and said, "My name is Peng Chen." Peng Chen behind him looked up at him. The woman looked at Tang Ning, a trace of doubt appeared on her face, and at this moment, a voice came from behind. "When did the champion of the Lantern Festival Poetry Festival, the crazy poet Tang Ning, change his name?" Tang Ning turned around and saw a young man walking over accompanied by several people. Among the people behind him, Tang Ning saw the son of the Minister of Rights. When Tang Ning looked at the woman again, he understood what was going on. It turned out that those foolish dudes in novels who offered themselves up to be slapped in the face were all fake. They actually thought of hiring extras and providing assists at the critical moment. The woman had come to her senses at this moment. Looking at Tang Ning, her face showed sadness again, and she said loudly, "Even if you turned into ashes, I would recognize you. You said you would marry me, but you have been gone for 2 years. Do you not want me anymore?" The faces of the people around him showed expressions of interest. "Is this, abandoning after having sex? I didn't expect that the crazy poet would have such a romantic affair. Someone actually came to my house. This is going to be exciting." Su Xiao came over from the back, looked at Tang Ning, and smiled, "This is what you did wrong, Tang Kuixiao. People who study are learning the words of saints and the way to cultivate themselves. How can you do such a thing of abandoning after having sex, which has a beginning but no end? Scholars should not only have profound knowledge, but also noble qualities. The imperial court not only selects talents, but also selects virtues. Most people with major stains in their lives will not have much development in their official careers. The same is true for the imperial examinations. The examiners can completely disqualify people who have passed the examinations because someone has abandoned his wife after having an affair with her." Su Xiao looked at Tang Ning and shook his head and said, "Even I can't stand what Tang Kuixiao did. Today I will make the decision for this girl." Even Tang Ning had to admit that throwing dirty water is almost unsolvable. If you admit it, you will abandon her after having an affair with her. If you don't admit it, you will abandon her after having an affair with her and not repent. Where did these Beijing dandies learn these disgusting methods? Tang Ning looked at the woman and said seriously, "Girl, I have never met you before and have no grudges against you. Why do you do this?" The woman's eyes showed a trace of hesitation, which soon became firm. She gritted her teeth and said, "Forget it. If you don't recognize me, I will leave. I will raise the child alone." After that, she ran out of the door quickly. Tang Ning couldn't let her go. If she left, this matter would never be cleared up. He just took a step forward and stopped. A figure appeared in front of the woman, blocking her way. Su Mei looked at the woman and asked, "Who ordered you?" The woman's face flashed a trace of panic, and she shook her head and said, "What order?" "Pa." Su Mei slapped her in the face and asked again, "Who ordered you?" The woman covered her face, stunned in place, trembling, "No one." "Pa." Su Mei slapped her on the other side of the face again and asked again, "Who ordered you?" "No. Pa." "Who are you?" "Pa." Tang Ning had to admit that at this moment, Su Mei was domineering. The woman's face was swollen on both sides. After being slapped on the face again, her knees softened and she knelt on the ground, saying in a lost voice, "I don't know, I just took the money, I don't know anything."